Friend, enemy, or frenemy? How do Indians view the rise of China and its implications for India's rise? Join the conversation on this important topic by taking the China Challenge Survey. The survey has been put together by researchers at the Takshashila institution. Answer our 10 simple questions and let your voice be heard in shaping India's policy towards China. For more details, log on to www.takshashila.org.in or you can click on the link and take the survey in the show notes. Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm your host for today. My name is Kripa Koshy, and I'm a program manager with the Takshashila Institution. Today, I have the pleasure of discussing a topic that I am personally very interested in and have the pleasure of chatting with someone who knows a lot more about this topic than I do. So we're really lucky to have a chance to chat with our guest. But before I jump into it, I just want to sort of focus on the theme of our discussion today is to talk about migration patterns in India and some of the impact on those patterns as a result of demographic pressures that might be coming up in the medium and long term for the country. Our guest today is Professor Chinmay Tumbe, and I'm going to do the hard work of trying to summarize his entire life's work in like 30 seconds or less. So you'll have to forgive me. I've cherry-picked a little bit about your background, Chinmay, but I'll just introduce you for those who might not be familiar with your work yet, and then we can jump into the substance of our conversation today. So Professor Chinmay Tumbe is currently an associate professor of economics at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. He's passionate about migration, cities, firms, and history. I like that. Very succinct 4 things that he's passionate about. And an alumnus of the London School of Economics and Political Science, the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, the Rua College, Mumbai, and the Rishi Valley School in Mundanpalli. He has been a faculty member at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Hyderabad. He was a 2013 Jean Monnet Fellow at the European University Institute in Florence and the 2018 Alfred D. Chandler Jr. International Visiting Scholar in Business History at Harvard Business School in Boston. Moving on to some of his notable writing, his first book, India Moving, A History of Migration, was published in 2018. And his second book, The Age of Pandemics, 1817 to 1920, How They Shaped India and the World, was published in 2020. He is a member of the Lancet COVID-19 India Task Force in 2020-2022, and the Working Group on Migration of the Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation in 2016 and 2017. I said the word migration a lot over there, and so spoiler alert, this is exactly our topic of discussion today. So before I invite Chinmay to sort of get into our discussion here today, I'll set a little bit of context for our listeners. So for those of you who might be following the issue of migration closely, you may have noticed that last month, the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs released the 2024 revision of World Population Prospects. And they did point out a number of very interesting trends that did, to some extent, touch on migration. The 2 very interesting trends that stood out to me really were that there's a population peak of 10.3 billion people that's expected to be reached in 2080. Followed by a population decline soon after that. And a second interesting trend that by 2080, persons aged 65 or older will outnumber children under 18, among other trends. So what we're going to discuss today is how some of these demographic trends will play out in the Indian context, how they'll actually have a spillover effect on migration trends, both globally and domestically. And it may be a bit of a clear statement or a fairly uncontroversial opinion to sort of put out there that migration is a topic of great interest to folks domestically and internationally, but it's also prominently a point of discussion in public policy discourse at union and state level governments in India. There are a lot of challenges and opportunities when we talk about migration in India, and we'll unpack some of that today. But really the questions that we're grappling with in our discussion is, how will some of these factors play out in the context of new demographic pressures? Is there a way to respond to some of these challenges? So Chinmay today is joining us to discuss all this and more, including as we talk about population pressures and demographic trends. What could something like an interstate migration council do to help manage some of the migration related impacts of these trends? So I've said a lot. I'm going to stop speaking and maybe turn things over to Chinmay with my first question. So, like we just said, there's a lot of projection around demographic pressures in India and the spillover impact this has on migration. You've recently written about this India Aging Report 2023, which was published by the UN Population Fund. So, it'll be really useful to unpack some of the trends here and how this ties into migration. So, the first question is, after all those words, can you walk us maybe through how population growth pressure, including the statistic I alluded to earlier at the global level, which was the increase in the number of persons aged like 65 and above, how some of this could have a ripple effect in migration in India?
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me over. I think the global demography, not just for India, but countries around the world, going through tremendous change, a tremendous churn. And when we talk about migration, there are two distinct modes of migration, or what people call as internal migration, that how people moving within the country, and international migration. And both of them are highly dependent on demographic dynamics. So I'll
Mm,
start very briefly by pointing out about the international scenario.
mm,
And we are in 2024, and this is a landmark year because from now on, the working age population in the rich world, that is the OECD countries, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, 38 countries like the US, lots of countries in Europe, and so on. The working age population of those countries, which is currently about 800 million people, is actually going to start declining from this year onwards. So it's never really been the case in the last 100 plus years that the working age population has fallen. And note that this is with immigration. That is, with
mm,
immigration, it would have been falling much, much faster. In fact, when people say, that immigrants are taking our jobs in the West and so on, without the immigrants, actually, the population would actually be falling, the working age population. So the immigrants are really propping up these economies. And the numbers are stuck. What's expected is in the next 25 years, the 65 plus age group population in these countries, OECD countries, is going to go from something like 18% to 27%. And that's quite dramatic. I mean, 10 percentage point shift towards the 65 plus age population. And what that means is that despite the tremendous anti-immigration rhetoric that you see around the world today, think of Donald Trump's speeches, think of the politics in Europe right now. Despite all that rhetoric, the pressures for international migration are going to only increase because there's just going to
mm,
be such a massive shortage of labor if you want to keep those economies going. For example, Italy elected a leader whose basic promise was to shut down migration, and
mm,
yet in her term, migration rates have actually increased. So there's the political rhetoric, anti-immigration, but on the ground, people are moving, and those countries, the firms, the employers at the local level need these folks, right? So this is a kind of a interesting kind of a situation that the rich world find itself. And the basic reason is that people are having very few kids, fertility rates have crashed, and so that's what's led to this demographic inversion, so to speak. In Japan, for instance, more diapers are sold for old people now than for young people.
yeah, mm,
It's just complete inversion of demographies that's taking place outside. And in India itself, though we say we are a relatively young country, we are also aging because
mm,
fertility rates are crashing even in India. And so this India Aging Report 2023, which is done by the UN Population Fund and IIPS in Mumbai, shows that the share of those age 60 plus in the population in India is set to rise from around 20%, 10% today to about 20% in 2050. Right? So that's another 10 percentage point shift,
mm,
but it's not as high as, say, close to 30% in Europe, but it's going to go up from 10 to 20% in the next 25 years. And by 2050, say Viksit Bharat happens by 2047, we would find ourselves in a position where the number of old people is about the same size as the population of the United States of America, right?
mm.
So that's what we're talking about
Exactly.
as, in terms of aging. So to kind of, I'll pause here, but just reflect that as the world ages, there's going to be tremendous demand for international migration, and a lot of that is going to be fueled by migration from India. So a lot of Indians are going to be accessing these labor markets, and that's also an opportunity. We should not see it as a kind of a problem that people are leaving the country, but if people are getting better wages outside India, let them go for it, and those
Mhm.
opportunities are going to open up. And then, of course, we can talk about the aging within India.
Hmm. Thank you so much for that. And I like that you sort of closed with the caveat that we sometimes have a bit of a negative connotation on migration when it's usually spoken of, but that there are a lot of opportunities that are presented by these movements that are happening both within and across our borders. Really useful, I think. So going into, I think, my next question. So even in the way I framed the conversation so far and how our discussion has gone, we've been speaking in a very average sense, in very general terms, speaking very broadly of India. But you've written a fair bit about how the reality of these trends actually play out very differently across different regions in India. There are very different realities that different states are grappling with now when they think of these demographic pressures and when they think about the consequences on migration. So maybe if you could touch a little bit on how some of these disparities, these regional disparities, will then affect migration, and then, as folks who have been following migration very closely will already be able to anticipate what my next question would be. Is the impact on internal migration, in particular, would be a really useful thing if you could touch on.
Sure. Within India, as I mentioned, Europe is aging and so on. Within India, the South is aging faster than the North at a very broad, crude level. Of course, there's some variations in the North as well. But Kerala, for instance, is at one end of the spectrum. Again, some statistics, by 2050, the share of aged in the Kerala's population will be about 25%, whereas in Bihar in the North, it would still be under 15%, right? So completely different demographic structures that we're going to see, a massive 10 percentage point difference in a basic demographic indicator between Kerala and Bihar. The Kerala's median age would be closer to 45 in 25 years' time, whereas Bihar's would be closer to 30. Right now, what does this mean? If the median age of the population, that's half the population, is over 45, versus in Bihar where half the population is under 30, it means that, and I'm deliberately choosing these two states, Kerala and Bihar. So let me start with this. Today when we look at migration patterns, so we're trying to understand how does aging impact migration within the country. And if you look at migration patterns today, two states with massive outmigration are paradoxically one of India's poorest states, which is Bihar, and one of India's richest states, which is Kerala, right? So two ends of the income spectrum, but you still get high rates of outmigration. And what's common to both right now is very high population density, especially
Mm,
on rural cultivable land. So that's the kind of connecting theme between Bihar and Kerala. But what's going to happen now is that you're going to see migration rates, that is outmigration rates from Kerala, systematically fall in the next 25 years, because the people who move are typically in the 20 to 40 age group,
mhm.
and you don't really see high out migration rates in the 40 plus age group. Now, as the bulk of the population now shifts in the 40 plus age group, automatically the kind of stock of potential migrants is going to systematically fall. So Kerala's migration story, which has been very strong for many decades, people from Kerala going to the Gulf in particular, that migration wave is going to slowly ebb. And the Kerala migration report is already showing kind of stagnation across the last decade. But precisely because of aging, out
Right.
migration from Kerala will reduce.
Would have to
That's
drop. Yeah.
one
Mm,
certainty. Whereas in Bihar, precisely because the population is still so young, the out migration is still going to go very, very high. It's going to
mm.
be very high even in 2050. And where are they going to go? Well, they're going to go, of course, to the Gulf to get better wages, but they're going to go outside India, but they're going to go in particular to South India. And we already see those ramifications in, just take Kerala again. There are about 2 to 3 million Keralites outside India, and then there are about 2 to 3 million North Indians in Kerala. Right,
Mm.
so it's a kind of a remarkable state of demographic churn. But what you're going to see 25 years hence is fewer Keralites leaving simply because they're not there. The young folk, as a
Right.
proportion of the population, is going to be
Mm.
much smaller. But precisely because they're going to age, just like in Europe, you're going to have this massive demand for young people to do all sorts of jobs. Now, what kind of jobs are we talking about? Construction sector jobs, informal
Mm.
service sector jobs, from security
Service.
guards to service. I mean, there's a huge range of jobs which simply 45 plus folks are simply not going to do. So where they're going to get them from? They're going to get them from a much younger North Indian labor migrant pool. And that's the really big story of migration in the next 25 years, is the North to South migration story. Simply
Mm.
because the South is richer and older than the relatively poorer and younger North. By North, I'm not talking of Punjab and Haryana and Delhi, but I'm really talking Bihar, UP, Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand, and states like that. So that's the big north to south migration. That's kind of it's already taking place. As I said, I mean there are no more
Right.
than 2 million North Indians in Kerala today. Earlier there was a linguistic divide. People did not
Mm,
want to, people rather move from Bihar to Mumbai or Surat because Hindi is still spoken than go to Tamil Nadu or Kerala. But today, when you're getting wages which are like 5 times more and so on, and also much better labor conditions, why would you not go there? So you find North Indians picking up the local languages, learning Tamil, conversational Malayalam,
mhm.
and so what was earlier a divide in the labor market by language is kind of being erased by the demographic divergence or difference, call it, between the north and the south. So that's the real big picture of what's happening, of how aging within India, which is again linked with fertility decline, which is again linked with income growth, etc.
Yeah.
How all of that is playing into internal migration dynamics. The north to south migration story is a 21st century migration story. It
Mhm.
wasn't really a 20th century migration story. People from Bihar, as I have written in my book, have been moving out for more than a century. But they went to the east, they went outside India. Think of the
Right.
indentured migration system. But
Mm.
the southward migration is a function of this rapid aging that we are seeing now. And so it's really a story of how demographic differences are playing out into internal migration dynamics.
Mhm. Wow. I mean, there's so many threads of conversation. Actually, I want to pick up from that. But just I'm mindful of time. I think maybe one question, if I could ask a little bit off the cuff, is do you think that receiving states, and this example now we've been focusing on Kerala for a bit, have been putting in this concerted effort to prepare the groundwork for this type of reality to happen? And I maybe I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, and when we're looking at the action that states could be taking to create a more conducive environment for migration to happen. But just since we've touched on this very briefly, of some of these trends have been seen for a while, like we have been seeing this north-south movement. Do you think there are states who are a little bit more better equipped to, or have been anticipating some of what preparing for this reality could be looking like locally?
Yeah, I think Myron Weiner, the political scientist, was probably the first person in the 90s to really write about this. The attitudes to migration and the political attitudes to immigrants, and how to host societies and host governments within India. He's talking about internal migration, and he was talking about Assam, which was very hostile to outsiders. The Sons of the Soil movement, which was very powerful in Mumbai and Assam, and he studied all this. And one of the interesting things he kind of observed is that societies which themselves had a lot of out migration
Mm.
were more receptive
We're
to in
prepared
migrants.
to receive, yeah. Hmm.
So if the Keralites are found all over the world, you would, I mean, in theory, you would say, why should the Keralites have a problem with people coming to Kerala? Because, you find Keralites around the world. And that's kind of true. It's similar with the Gujaratis. I live in Gujarat right now. And in my, almost a decade out here, very rarely do you find anti-migration rhetoric, even rhetoric. Forget actually doing something about it.
Right.
Right. So again, it's because Gujaratis have traveled really around the world, around India,
Themselves, yeah.
and so on. So I think as a working hypothesis, states which have themselves seen a lot of out migration and are now at the other end of the income spectrum and receiving a lot of migrants, classic cases being Gujarat and Kerala, are going to be less hostile, and so on. And Kerala, of course, is by many yardsticks they've been uh, quite welcoming to outsiders. They have these schooling systems.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and a lot of migrants studies have shown that the migrants are kind of are choosing to go to Kerala precisely because of better labor conditions
Mm.
and better condition and so on. Now outside Kerala, of course, in the south, if you just take the other major states, Tamil Nadu, massive migration wave to Tamil Nadu's manufacturing clusters from the north. Once in a while, you get anti-migrant rhetoric, but as we saw a few months back, there was a kind of a slight scare. But immediately, when there was some rumors and some evidence of people being
Mm.
asked to go back, the industrial demands for it are so great that the industry kind of clamps down on the anti-migration rhetoric which
Mm.
is out there and forces the government to come out with clarification saying, look, we love you guys, please stay with us because we need you guys to work our factories. Having said that, there are of course a lot of states of India which, interestingly, even the out migration states like Jharkhand, which is an out
Mm.
migration state, which is seemingly anti, let's call them nativist. Nativist states are those who are
Mm.
trying to do something preferential for their own people. And by the Constitution of India, you and I can move across India and work anywhere except a few places which are restricted by the Constitution itself. But overall, there are basic provisions in the Constitution which allows freedom of mobility, right?
Mm-hmm.
And every state government trying to kind of become a bit nativist is kind of going against that. So broadly put, there are some states there. I would say out of our 30 plus states, there are very few like Gujarat and Kerala,
Mm.
which are, I would say, very good in terms of welcoming migrants, uh, in the sense that they are not at least pushing them back, even if they don't really do out of their way to welcome migrants. They're not actively, there's no anti migrant, there's no kind of nativist streak in some of these states. But that's not quite true in a lot of other states, where you see creeping nativism. Coming in across political parties, across political manifestos. There seems to be an urge to reserve jobs for locals. And Karnataka tried that recently, and massive uproar against that. So,
Mm-hmm.
so this idea of job reservation for locals, in my view, is stemming from some sort of a larger jobs issue in India. But the migrant is the classic person to blame. And whether it's in European American politics, where the immigrant is blamed, or whether it's in internal Indian politics, where the out migrant or the in migrant is blamed, the political tendency to blame the outsider is very, very strong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'm going to choose to land on that optimistic note that you had stated earlier, where there is an interest and there is a capacity actually for some of these states to become sort of a welcoming space for these migrants to be received, and also present like really hopefully strong case studies and examples for states that might be lagging behind in some regard or who might not quite. It is quite helpful to the power of an example to be able to see, oh, this is how it's playing out in Kerala, for example, or this is how industry responded in Tamil Nadu. It might actually inspire a little more optimism for other states as they might be grappling with their own migration tensions. So I'm just going to shift our conversation a little bit, Chinmay, that we've talked about states a fair bit, but something that I've appreciated in some of your writing is just touching on activity that's happening at the district level can actually be quite revealing of the reality of migration. The idea that movement actually between districts is still sometimes more notable than even movement across states. So maybe I'll just ask you, are there any revealing trends that you think we need to be mindful of when we're considering these upcoming demographic pressures, and the conversation tends to be sort of locked between central and state government sometimes? Should we be paying closer attention to what's happening at the district level?
Yeah, I think migration analysis at one level, at the political level, is at the state level. For example, Karnataka saying we don't want outsiders. You're not going to find a district in Karnataka saying we don't want people from other districts of Karnataka, right? I mean, that would be really ultra nativism. But I don't think that has ever happened in India. So really, state is the unit of analysis for political rhetoric. But migration happens through clusters and corridors, and
Mm,
those are highly based at the district level. The one key thing to understand, hence, is that though we say, for example, that Gujarat is a state of in migration, that is true on a net basis. That means more people come to Gujarat than more people
mm,
leave. But when we say people are coming to Gujarat, they're essentially coming to Surat, Ahmedabad, and Gandhinagar, which are literally 3 out of 30 odd districts of Gujarat. In fact, there are many, many districts of Gujarat where there is mass out migration.
mm,
So that's the first thing. That is when we say, when we break India into, we can kind of divide India into like the receiving states and sending states. So typically people who think of Gujarat as a receiving state and Orissa or Bihar as a sending state. The fact is that when you look at the district level, it turns out that there are every state of India has at least a few district clusters with mass out migration. So in
mm,
Gujarat, for example, Bhavnagar, Amreli, these are districts with mass out migration. You think of Maharashtra, people say it's in migration. Well, most districts of Maharashtra have net out migration. That's
I
just
see.
remarkable.
Mm,
It's essentially Mumbai and Pune and Thane which kind of get. I mean, Ratnagiri has had mass out migration for more than 100 years now,
mm,
and so on. The entire west coast of India, if you think of it as a region from Ratnagiri to Kanyakumari, literally every district from Ratnagiri to Kanyakumari is a zone of out migration. So when you look at the state level, you don't really see it, but it turns out in district level maps, you can see these.
mm,
And because if you want to target migrant workers in particular through programs and so on, you really need to understand, hence, the district to district corridors, and that's why the district to district mapping is very important. Unfortunately,
That
the
is.
last time we could do
Mm.
that was in the 1990s. We don't really have good data since then, to understand these flows. But we have a good sense of which districts are part of, the migration flows. And as I said, districts in Himachal, districts in Uttarakhand, districts in Rajasthan, districts in Karnataka, in Tamil Nadu, like Sivaganga in Tamil Nadu, is a district of mass out migration. And so,
Mm.
so I think it's important to look at the district for the not for the political end, because there's really not much political kind of
Right.
rhetorics which is framed at the district level.
Mm-hmm.
As I said, no district is going to say, people from other districts are not allowed here. But it's the analysis of migration patterns that needs to be done at the district level rather than the state level. Otherwise, you start looking at Gujarat as, oh, Gujarat is always getting people. But, hey, there are lots of districts in Gujarat which are actually sending people out, not only to the major city of Gujarat, but they're sending people outside Gujarat.
Mm.
So lots of people from Gujarat are also moving out of the country, moving out of the state, and so on. For example, I mean, there's a department of non-resident Gujaratis, and
Yeah.
I mean, you
Much like
can
in
think
Kerala.
much like in Kerala, and you have more Gujarati associations by one count outside Gujarat within India than outside India. I mean, I used to live in St. Louis in the US for a bit, and we used to have these Garba nights with the Gujarati Samaj of St. Louis. Now, this is a Gujarati Samaj of, like, one small town in the US, and there are literally thousands of these Gujarati Samajas across the world. In Thailand, you have a Gujarati Marwadi Samaj, which is a rare combination of two different communities tying up.
Fascinating.
But there are more Samajas in India outside Gujarat of the Gujaratis
Right,
uh,
right, right.
than actually even around the world. So, is Gujarat a receiving state? Yes, on a net basis.
Hmm.
But there's a lot of out migration from Gujarat as well. So
Yeah.
we're a country where there's fair amount of movement which is happening across different kinds of.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, district also matters because of the biggest migration of India, which is women's migration for marriage. And a lot of that is intra-district or across district, borders that
Hmm.
tends to be much more localized migration. Almost every adult woman in India is a migrant,
Mm-hmm.
and almost all of that is a district story.
Hmm. I mean, I'm just so happy that we covered some of that ground because I think it's a nuance that is sometimes missing when we're having these, like, very, sometimes very lofty conversations in the political realm of migration, good, bad, which states are, have a lot more activity compared to others that might have less. But I think introducing this nuance is useful that, paying close attention to even corridors is actually quite revealing of what movement looks like within a state as well. So now that we've spent some time at the district level, I'm moving us back out to the state level, if you don't mind. So, this episode I wanted to name is an Interstate Migration Council, the need of the hour. You've written a fair bit about this as being a proposed policy solution. But maybe for those who might be hearing of this for the very first time, I think I'll ask some, sort of rudimentary questions to ease us into it. What would the role be of such a council, and the value really of such a council, really? And you've given examples in the past of, like interstate water sharing agreements, and other such examples, as good examples maybe that we could follow. So could you elaborate on some of that? So why, maybe if I could reframe my entire question, why do you think an interstate migration council is perhaps the need of the hour?
Yeah, I think the fact that nativism is on the rise, and there's a clear evidence of that. Think of Haryana passing a law, restricting. In this working paper I wrote for the Center for Policy Research, I document different states, passing laws or passing policies or basically showing intent to reserve jobs for locals, right? And a blatantly anti-constitutional move, the Haryana government order, which was, by the way, just for, it was so ridiculous. It basically said, if you earn less than 30,000 rupees, so in those job categories, we will have, something like 80% job reservation for locals. So if you're rich in India, you can go to Haryana and nobody cares. But if you are earning less than 30,000, then
My
the
goodness.
80% rule shall kick in. And again, the idea is like a benevolent idea. So we, restrict jobs for locals and so on. But most economists, social scientists, researchers would argue, or especially industrial bodies would argue that, this is really not the right way to think
Mm.
about jobs. And often these jobs are done because the locals don't want to do that. So suppose these jobs are reserved for locals, will the locals actually do these jobs? I mean, that's the
Mm.
basic, point that has to
Valid
be made.
question. Yeah. Mm.
And if they're not, then what you're going to find is firms will move out to some other place which is so
More
if
conducive,
you
yeah.
don't allow people to move with their feet, the firms will move with their feet, and then you're left with less jobs overall for your
Right.
locals. Right? So that's the basic economic kind of argument against restricting movement into your place. And it's not just Haryana; it's Jharkhand, it's Maharashtra, it's so many states which have got the anti-migrant rhetoric going on. And what's surprising to me is that there's while the constitutional is very clear that you can move across states of India and work, and there are judgments to uphold that, there really is no kind of a central level, union level backing of it. And hence we keep getting these things, what we saw in Karnataka a few weeks back, of some minister, someone comes to power and thinks, okay, this is a great idea. Right? And of course, we've seen this in another realm. We've seen this in two major realms. One is, of course, water sharing, but that's also very, very, I would say, localized. But the big thing which was done in the last decade was a goods and service tax council. So we
Mm.
do have a council framework which is out there, and there are many ways in which an interstate migration council can be anchored. The first could be within the existing framework of India's interstate council. This was
Mhm.
established formally in 1990 under Article 263, based on the recommendations of the 1988 report of the Sarkaria Commission. And the council basically could be nested in a ministry, in this case, the Ministry of Home Affairs. And it should consist of the Prime Minister, Chief Minister of States, and different heads of union territories and cabinet rank ministers. So this is one kind of approach, or you have a completely different approach, which would be anchoring the interstate migration council, which I'm arguing with, just like the GST council is closely linked with the Ministry of Finance. Uh,
Mm.
Interstate migration. So the GST Council is about the movement of goods and services across India. People don't understand that. People think it's about goods and services. People don't really realize that why are the states important players in this? Because there's movement across state borders. One of
Mm.
the reasons of having this was to stop those queues at state borders. Right, these trucks would just stop at these state borders, and today we have a much more seamless kind of a flow of activity across state
Mhm.
borders. And the GST Council, of course, a lot of negotiations which keep happening at these council meetings. But over about nearly a decade now, some structures in place. And most importantly, it's a way where stents can vent out, right? So
Mm.
it's a place where people can at least be heard, saying that, we've not got our dues and so on. So it's at least a deliberative mechanism. With migration, there seems to be nothing like that. And often, for example, we saw during COVID, right, when people were walking back home and so on, migrant workers were walking back home in the first lockdown, the migration crisis. States were really clueless. They were clueless about how many people were there in destination. They were clueless about what they should do for them when they came back.
Mm.
So recipient and kind of receiving state governments were fairly clueless about migration data and various things related with migration. And that's why I think, like the GST Council for Goods and Services and Interstate Migration Council for Human Beings is a worthy idea in the context of growing nativism. If we didn't have nativism, then there's no need for a council like this. But
Mm.
because we get these consistent, heads of nativism coming up, and which I think is only going to grow, it's not going to go down. Because if there's no such council, what you're going to see, there's going to be more north to south migration. You're going to find more kind of anti-North Indian rhetoric, growing up in South India and so on. The Tamilians are going to feel that the Hindi is conquering Tamil Nadu and so on. There's a lot of potential political conflict that is going to brew up if this is not kind of sorted out, and that's why an interstate migration council as a mechanism, mainly to deliberate issues linked with migration. But the basic idea has to be to uphold the constitution ideal that anybody can move pretty much anywhere within the country. So that's the idea of the council.
Mhm. Mhm.
And now, in terms of what the council can specifically do and so on, I think it should be kind of housed within the Ministry of Labor and Employment, because most of these guys moving across states are kind of migrant workers at the low end jobs. But it should also have people from different ministries like housing, which is a huge concern in India. Of course, MSME, Home Ministry, Health,
Mm.
Education, Ministry of Rural Development, Ministry of Urban Development. You can think of some Ministry of Transport, Ministry of Railways. The railways being a lifeline for migrant workers. The reason we got that migration crisis in 2020 was because the railways were shut down. And there's so many ways in which the railways can actually make life easier and safer
Mm.
for migrant workers. So there are many nodal agencies which could be a part of this. And of course, you need to have state governments, labor ministries. So it can just be a simple network of state government labor ministries, but where a migration specific kind of concern is there. And you don't have to meet every month. You can meet once a quarter, once in half 6 months. And the objectives of this body, in my view, should be fourfold. One, it has to uphold the constitutional provisions on
Mm.
interstate migration.
Mobility, yeah.
Two, it should collect and disseminate real-time information on interstate migration by location, sector of work, and gender. And I think
Mhm.
that's possible today with the kind of data we are collecting from eShram and a lot of these other portals, transport data. It should promote the portability of social security benefits. Today, we have the One Nation, One Ration Card scheme. So you can access the PDS anywhere in theory. Lots of other schemes like the, say, Anganwadis and so on.
Mhm.
Studies are showing that migrants feel intimidated, especially migrant women feel intimidated to use Anganwadis in cities. In fact, they go back to villages to access, healthcare back there because
Mm.
they find, limited access in cities and so on. And this is again a great place to make a policy intervention because there's
Mm.
so many migrant workers coming from different states out there. And the fourth objective should be to resolve interstate migration disputes, just like you have these water sharing tribunals who kind of thrashing out issues even in Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. I think for migration, anytime an issue flares up, this is an issue essentially with a source state and a recipient state, and they need to thrash it out in the Interstate Migration Council.
Mhm.
So I think the idea of a council comes from the fact that nativism is growing and it needs to be crushed. Nativism is a bad idea. Nativism I mean, again, for the listeners, nativism being defined here as my state is only for me, right? And I mean, we've defined it at the country level as nationalism and stuff like that. But if you're going to become so parochial and start guarding each state, and then I don't know the next level, the city, nobody born outside the city can be a part of my city.
Mm.
It makes very
That's
limited
very
sense
slow.
at
Mm.
the federal level, especially when it's clearly anti-constitutional, right? So,
Mhm.
um, I mean, if you think of yourself as a global citizen, right, and you go to the US and say, look, I'm a global citizen, why you guys have problem with me? The fact is that at the national level, people will say, we have the right to throw you out, we have the right to deport you, and stuff.
Mhm.
But at the within country level, we're saying that, look, the constitution anyway gives you the provision to move anywhere and work.
Mhm.
Why make? I mean, of course, there's some zones you can't go to, like ecosystems, forests, and some places where you can't just settle down and so on.
Mhm.
And even in the Northeast, a lot of places are blocked out for employment. But apart from that, most places in India you can work. And I think
Mhm.
the spirit of this council should be to uphold those values.
Mm. Yeah, I think, yeah, folks who might, be hearing sort of your impassioned argument for institutionalizing something like this, I think might also see that, the value of institutionalizing something is that it can sort of withstand a little bit of shifts in political wind and moving in different directions. Like if there is some common consensus that can be landed on to have something like this that's ingrained in the system, then there's room for some of it to ebb and flow, sure, based on political leanings and directions. But at the very core, it recognizes that migration is a reality, has remained a reality, will continue to be a reality for the country. So why not put our heads together, collaborate, have this sort of cross-sectoral, multidisciplinary sort of approach to how we can manage it. So I think you've laid out the arguments for it really well. So we've covered, a lot of ground, and we're sort of nearing the end of our time together. But if I could ask you the hard question of if you had to select, three key takeaways for folks who've been following along in the conversation here. There have been some really good themes, I think, that we've covered in the short time together. But if you wanted sort of a listener to take away three key learnings from all that you've shared, what would you land on?
Yeah, I think first is that demography in India is almost certainly destiny, which means that
Mm.
you can predict the future. A fairly, economic forecasting is tough, but demographic projection, demographic forecasting is far more easier than economic forecasting. For example, will Kerala, Maharashtra GDP growth rate grow at 5% or 10% or 15% per annum? I really don't know in the next 25 years. But its glide path of the fertility rate is almost certain. I mean, demographic projections have been fairly accurate, and we know that this is going only one way across the world. Fertility has not bumped up in the countries which they've tried everything, like Sweden and Japan, to have people have more kids and so on. They've managed to bump it up by like zero point 0.1 total fertility rate, which went down to say 1.1 is now up to 1.2. It's hardly anything. And India, many states of total fertility rate is already lower than the replacement level, which is 2.1. So
Yeah.
people are having fewer kids, and population is going to grow slower and slower. It's going to age. So these are demographic realities
Mm.
which will take place. And precisely because gaps will emerge in age cohorts, it will lead to substantial reshuffling and migration. So that's the first takeaway, that the massive demographic differences within India will drive a lot of the internal migration dynamics of the next 25 to 50 years. The second is something we've not talked about, but I think very important in the Indian context, which is linked with politics and delimitation exercise. Right? So this is a political hot potato in 2026, where potentially, because if they actually do it, North India will get far more Lok Sabha seats. So delimitation, for the listeners, is a process where every few years you adjust the number of constituents in the country based on population, the actual population at that point. To give an example of how this works in the Indian context, this was frozen at the 1971 census levels, right? And now, in 50 years' time, if you take the most recent, say 2011 census and so on, or whatever the census comes next, the share of UP in total population of India has basically gone up, precisely because they developed arguably slower than, say, Tamil Nadu or many other states of India, right? So this is the classic penalizing for good performance, right? So a lot of states in India are going to see their shares in the Lok Sabha actually go down because they did good things, right? So it's about as crazy as it gets. And it's because between 1971 and 2011 or 2021, we were in a phase of what is called as the demographic transition, that is birth rates crash. But in the next 50 years, say 2021 to 2071, what's interesting is that what will change the population dynamics across the country is not going to be that much about birth rates, because birth rates are kind of slowly converging across states, but it's going to be a lot of migration, which means in 2071, you might find that a lot of people from North India have gone and moved to South India. And so the South Indian populations have actually gone up. This is, for example, to give you an example from the US. In California, for instance, the California share of the overall House of Representatives went from 11 out of 435 in 1910 to 53 out of 435 in 2010. Right? So from 11 seats, it went up to 53. And why did that go up in the US? Not because of birth rates or death rates, because more people moved to California. And that is why Tamil Nadu, if it's done, and that's because, so we're saying you're rewarding that state with more representation, but that's because it's done something, it's got industrial dynamism or whatever you want to call it, and more people are flocking there, more people are voting with their feet, and more people are going to, for example, South India because of the opportunities it offers. So delimitation, the message here is that delimitation 2026 is really fraught with a lot of potential political tensions, and again, in my view, should be kicked down the road, to a few more decades, when migration actually will start becoming an important player in the redistribution of population. And in 2071, if you go for delimitation, migration may have kind of balanced out what the natural growth effects or the birth rate, death rate kind of thing had done between 1971 and 2021. So that's the second takeaway. The first was about demographic change leading to internal migration. The second is about how it impacts delimitation, and how do you think of demographics, migration, and delimitation. And the third is that nativism, the political attitudes to migration, is unfortunately on the rise in India, and maybe it's time to have a institutional grounding response to it. And one of the things I'm proposing is an interstate migration council, something like the good GST, but not as elaborate as the GST. Could be based within the Ministry of Labor and Employment, but some way to resolve fights between states on the issue of migration, because these fights, in my view, will only intensify as we're going to see more north to south migration and more all sorts of migration within the country. We definitely need a mechanism to just tell states saying, hey, stand off. as per the constitution, it's permitted. Now, within that, how can we alleviate your concerns?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that, Chinmay. I think I really appreciated that we had that time to sort of summarize the three key ideas there. And for those who'd like to learn a little bit more, Chinmay has written extensively about this topic. Most recently, we were sharing some of the key ideas in an article that he wrote for Mint, but has written extensively elsewhere. So please do make an effort to seek out more information on things that maybe were not completely clear to you or were brand new concepts or startling new facts that you suddenly discovered about migration in our time together. Purely for lack of time, we have to end our conversation here, Chinmay, but I just want to thank you so much for your time, for just all the valuable commentary that you've given us on this issue. It's really helpful to hear from someone who's taken the time to understand some of what really are unwieldy, complex sort of dynamics that seem to have such a ripple effect across really every dimension of society and every facet of our lives. Sometimes I feel that's the beauty of migration, but sometimes the pain of migration. So just a big thank you, and for our listeners to stick around and listen to the next episode of ATP that will be coming your way. Thank you again.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.